Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be trimming this overgrown tank, so stay tuned. So the first thing I want to do is trim the foreground Monte Carlo, and by trimming the foreground I have a good leeway into the midground and the background. So it will kind of guide me through the rest of my trimming process. So for the foreground, I really like using the UNS wave scissors, and as you can see it has a really big S-curve to it, so that when I'm trimming into very narrow areas and delicate areas, just like the foreground right here, I can get the really hard to reach plants that are overgrown onto the hardscape. Move the light out of the way, grab my scissors, and then let's get to trimming. So as you can see, even when my arm is in a really awkward position, it's very easy to trim the foreground. I'm gonna trim the foreground pretty low, just because once the plant starts overgrowing like this, the tops might look fine, but the bottom layers start to get shaded by themselves. So in order for more light to reach, you're going to want to trim. And I find trimming planted tanks not a hassle, but it's a pretty satisfying process. You can see that looks like my arm's in a really awkward position, but because of the wave scissors, I'm able to reach areas with very little to very minimal strain on my hands. You wouldn't be able to trim like this with, say, for example, straight scissors or even regular curved scissors. So right now, I'll also use my hands or tweezers to remove the overgrown midground plants that are now growing into the foreground. And I'll just gently move them around, just so I can cut the rest of the foreground. And I'll do fine detail cutting after more plants are cut, and I can see where the Monte Carlo has also overgrown. Sometimes hardscape just gets in the way, so when you're actually planning an aquascape, you kind of want to make sure that it doesn't get in the way of maintenance. Okay, we'll do some fine tuning later on as I move further and further back. But right now, I'm gonna just clear out some of the trimmings and then move on. So I'm just gonna net out some of the trimmings first. You'll notice that once you start to trim a lot, your lighting gets dimmer and dimmer. That's because the trimmings are obviously blocking out the light. So you wanna clear out as many trimmings as you can during this process so that you maintain some sort of visibility inside the tank, which is what I'm doing now. I'll just do my best to net out as much as possible. The rest will just be siphoned out during a water change right after this. Speaking of water changes, you'll notice that as you trim more and more, your tank might get cloudier. That's because there's a lot of detritus and debris that's actually settling into the plants, and no matter what type of filtration you have, it might not be able to filter it out of your tank, just because when the plants grow so densely, it kind of traps the detritus too. So this is also why you kind of want to trim your tank on a regular basis. And that detritus often leads to a lot of algae problems, so you don't want to leave it in your tank. So trimming is a good thing. It shouldn't be a chore. All right, now that I got most of the trimmings out of the way, I'm gonna move on to the mid-ground. I'll go to the two corners and start cutting the mid-ground, which is Styrogyne repens, I believe. Yes, Styrogyne repens. This is technically a stem plant that grows pretty compact. Now, usually I'm really careful not to trim off any leaves, but since it's been such a long time since the last trimming, it's hard to avoid that. So I'll just be extra careful. If there are any healthy tops, I'll just replant them back into the bunch right here. As you can see, this plant is suffering just slightly because it's not getting enough light. The tops of it is shading itself pretty much at this point. So trimming is a good thing. The background plants have already grown into this. I might have to pull it out with some tweezers. It's really well rooted. So now I'll reach in, gently tug on this plant to remove it. It's the background Echinodorus that's grown into the midground and the foreground. It's pretty crazy how plants have a mind of their own. Try my best to remove all the bad leaves and any detritus that gets stuck in here. And then I'll save these trimmings and replant them later. So Styrogyne repens trimmings, I'll replant. Monte Carlo, I don't need to replant because it's just growing crazy. Now I'll move on to this side. Start trimming the same way. Okay, now with the Styrogyne repens cut, it's time to move on to the Alternanthera Reinecki mini. It's not so mini in this tank, as you can see, but it is a really awesome red plant. So I'm trying to be very careful not to trim off the leaves. And fun fact, there's a ton of Alternanthera species or types in this hobby. Some are green, some are red, some are purple. That's what makes this plant super amazing. I'm not going to trim this too short. I still want it to show up after the trim. Because this is so bushy and so healthy right now, I might not even need to replant the top trimmings of this plant. And it's okay if you accidentally cut off a leaf or two on the plant. It's not the end of the world. Sometimes it's just unavoidable. Okay, I'll move on to this side. If I can see, this side's relatively low still, so I'm not going to trim too much. try to find the stem though. Alright, now that the Reneki Mini is slightly trimmed, I'll move on to the part that I wasn't looking forward to, which is trimming the Echinodorus overgrowth. We originally planted, this is Echinodorus Zingu, closer to the background, but it's a pretty vigorous grower. So eventually it grew into the foreground and the midground. So now we're trying to separate it again. Cutting any or trimming any Echinodorus is like cutting grass, actually. So you can cut the blades off. It's a carpeting plant, so it sends off runners. So it sends out these shoots and it grows another few blades of plant, and then it keeps on going. So these runners are what's causing it to grow into the foreground and the midground. I'm going to trim those off and remove them as I go. You can technically trim just a runner, the part of the runner, and you can remove the plant that way. This plant is a heavy root feeder, so you don't want it to grow so much that eventually it outcompetes itself for nutrients from the substrate. So I'm just thinning the plant out by selectively trimming off some blades and leaving the others. That way it's not super dense. There's so much of this plant that I'm being pretty generous when I'm trimming. I'm not too worried about accidentally trimming off too much. Alright, so I finally got to the background, and this is the last plant. The plant before this was Echinodorus Zingu, which took a while just because I was trying to thin it out but not trim everything. So I was going pretty much blade by blade and picking and choosing which to keep and which to cut. Now I'm going to do the same thing with this giant Echinodorus right here. I believe it's Blaheri. And the cool thing about this plant is that it's flowering right now. These are actual flower stalks from the plant itself, which means it's pretty happy, which is a good sign. Now I'm just gonna select some of the older leaves and just trim them off. Otherwise, they'll start to wither away on their own anyways. So by trimming the plant, you're actually promoting growth rather than the plant having to spend a lot of energy trying to keep its old leaves that it wants to eventually shed anyways. So I'm just going down to the leaf stalk and cutting out leaf by leaf. And since this is a larger plant, it's much easier to do so. Now, fun little fact about this tank is that all of the different types of species of the plants used and planted in this tank are actually from South America. So you'll find Echinodorus, Monte Carlo, Styrogram repens. In the wild, if you were to go down to South America. So I think we finally finished trimming the tank. Now let's go back to the balder areas and replant some of the healthy stem tops that we saved. So it's in the midground area where the Styrogram repens is and where the Alternandera Reneki Mini are. all replanted. Now let's get a water change going, and once the tank is clean and the filter is fitted back on, we have another nice planted aquarium again. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you like what you saw today, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell. Until next time, see ya, bye.